Today on Locked On Red Wings, could a trade for Martin Necas help solve Detroit's issues on the top six?
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. I'm a former broadcast producer for 97.1 The Ticket, where Scotty's the host over at Locked On Tigers, as well as a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. Thanks for making us your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And make sure you go give Scotty's podcast, Locked On Tigers, a listen, as he's going to be talking, I'm sure, about the Jim Leland retirement ceremony that's going to be happening. That's sick that he's getting his number retired with the Detroit Tigers, as well as, I assume, the Torkelson option. In fact, that episode's already up. I saw that.
Yes. Yesterday, as people are listening to this episode, is all Torkelson. Yeah, it's been a heck of a 48 hours over in Tigersville for sure.
Well, nice of them to give you something a little bit positive and sentimental to talk about the Jim Leland situation.
Yes, very much so.
Here on Locked On Red Wings, we're going to be talking about a hypothetical trade for Martin Necas. We're in that time of the offseason, right? We're going to be going over a lot of hypothetical signings, hypothetical drafts, hypothetical trades to try and improve this team as they just barely missed the playoffs, literally on a tiebreaker in the waning moments of Game 82. Like, what could they get to get over that hump? And Martin Necas is somebody who finds his name in the conversation all the time right now with being dealt out of Carolina. Their situation's really unique. The Carolina Hurricanes are projected to have about $26 million of cap space, which is quite a bit. It's about the same amount the Red Wings have, but they have a lot of guys that they have to sign. And there's reports that they're really, and of course it makes sense, Guentzel was so good for them post-trade deadline after they acquired him, that they're going to make a push to try and retain Jake Guentzel. But if you do that, and his going rate's going to be $9 million, and you also have to re-sign Jack Drury and Maxime Comtos and Seth Jarvis as well. I'm probably mispronounced at least one of those names for the people listening.
I think you did pretty well.
I think I did okay. One of these guys has got to give, and Martin Necas, who is reportedly not super happy with the role that he has, is a pending RFA, due a decent pay raise, seems to be the guy that everyone looks to as this is the guy that might get traded away. And, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, first, Scotty, because, again, we don't need to rehash would Detroit want him, because we have this conversation every time we have we talk about a hypothetical where it's like, well, if we got the notification today that they were traded to the Detroit Red Wings, we'd be like, yeah, cool. Like, he's a really talented young player. He brings a lot to the table. Let's just jump right into why he could be a fit for the Detroit Red Wings and what his pros are, right? Scotty, last season with the Carolina Hurricanes, he put up 53 points, a little bit of a down year for him. The year prior, he put up Lucas Raymond level productions. Again, he's a right winger. He had 28 goals and 43 assists for 71 points in 82 games the 2 seasons ago. And this past year in 77 games, he had 53 points, 24 goals, 29 assists. A little bit of a down year after bursting onto the scene the year before. He is an offense-first winger that can both be a playmaker and score goals. Like, we talk about the biggest need, right, Scotty, that this top six needs with the Detroit Red Wings, and that is it. They need another top six winger who's capable of producing. We saw it with, and of course, David Perron played left wing with the Red Wings a lot, being he likes to play on his offside for the one-timers, but they genuinely lacked a top six winger. And if Patrick Kane walks away, you're going to have another hole to fill. So, like, the most no-duh hole that this fills right now is just your need for another top six winger, and he's young and an RFA. So, like, he would fit that cup window.
Yeah, I think the angle that consistently is brought up with Necas is his role on the Canes. And like you had alluded to that already, so I don't want to like re-dive and just repeat everything you said, but I do think that they are, as far as their priorities go in terms of locking up a lot of the players on their current roster long term, he is probably the guy that is on the outside looking in, which is why he finds himself in trade conversations. I think that when it comes to the fit on the wings, again, like obviously, yeah, that would be a great plug-in. He addresses really kind of that all around like what you're looking for, right? In a top six forward, obviously, as you mentioned, like has the ability to score goals, has the ability to be a little bit more of a playmaker. That was such a giant hole for this team this season. They were one top six forward short, like pretty consistently throughout the year. And then, when injuries or whatnot happened, then they became two. But yeah, like consistently throughout the year, we were like, we have 5 legitimate, like just plug and play top 6 forwards, and they need one more. And like you said, if Kane leaves, that opens the hole for another. But I think that, Necas specifically not only fits in terms of just play style and whatnot. I think he would be fine in the system. He also is a guy that has obviously a history playing in a very defensive minded system. So if you're looking for somebody that can fit the wings, this we want to be really good at defense. We want forwards that are good at defense. Not that he's like necessarily lockdown, but this is a guy that played for the Hurricanes. So like, yeah, he's probably somewhat at least used to and comfortable playing in that type of somewhat of a similar system, defensive oriented and minded. But I think the biggest thing is age. And like, that's going to be a big reason as to why his price tag in a trade would be higher. But I think, he's 25, 26 years old. Like this is a guy that you could trade for and then extend if you are, obviously that would be the plan if you brought him in. And so that is, I think the next conversation is not only are you having to give up assets to bring him in, then you are also going to have to take a decent chunk of your cap and extend him long-term as well. And the conversation is doing both of those things worth the production you would get? But in terms of just on the ice immediately, yeah, it would be an awesome plus to add to this lineup.
So you mentioned 2 things there that I actually want to touch back on later in the episode, because when you talk about usage and his role with Carolina, them being a defensive-oriented team, I want to push back on that in segment 2 when we get to that, because that's actually one of the cons that I have written down, because that is reportedly one of the reasons he wants out of Carolina, because he doesn't like that type of system. And if it comes to Detroit, we'll get into that in segment 2, right, as one of the potential downsides. In terms of cap, right, like that's another thing too that's going to be a huge question mark and could be a major con for the Detroit Red Wings, because he's talented, which means he's going to need to be paid, and the reported ask for him is a lot. But before we get to that, I want to keep chugging along with these pros, right, Scotty? With the Carolina Hurricanes this year, he was 3rd in 5-on-5 points. And let's not, also a top 6 forward, he played, I think he had the most minutes among forwards at 5-on-5 for the Carolina Hurricanes this past year. He was 3rd in 5-on-5 points. Over 30 of his points came at 5-on-5. He played about second. He played, I think, he got bounced around between the first and second power play, but by the end of the season, I think he was 6th on the team, in 5th or 6th on the team in total power play minutes played. So he does get a lot of power play, does not get a ton. I think he had like 9 minutes total on the penalty kill this year. He's not a guy you're going to look for the penalty kill. But like, even though it was a down year, right? Like 53 points for Martin Necas is very good. 24 goals, 29 assists, and 77 games played. Like I think I said it a couple weeks ago, like we often, I think, overlook, because we want so desperately that next 35, 40 goal scorer, and that's necessary to win a Stanley Cup, right? And Lucas Raymond and Dylan Larkin have proven this past year that they have that extra gear in them to try and get to that level. Like what Lucas Raymond had 31 goals and Dylan Larkin had 33. We kept saying if Dylan Larkin had played all 82, he would have probably been a 40-goal scorer for the Detroit Red Wings this year. I actually firmly believe that with how good he was when he played. And Alex DeBrincat, we obviously know, has a track record of being a 40-goal scorer. But we often, because we are pursuing that mountaintop, that goal out of a forward, we often overlook how hard it is to just score 25 to 30 goals in the NHL. And Martin Necas in back-to-back seasons has scored 24 and 28 goals a season. That is top 6 level production goal scoring. And so 53 points in 77 games played is still really good top 6 production and fills that hole. So I think that in terms of the fact, just bare minimum, right? You mentioned it. That age is perfect for the Detroit Red Wings. He's 25 years old. He fits the long-term sustainability window of trying, because the window's trying to open. That way his prime is 25 through 33. He'd be here for when the Red Wings need to try and make that push for the playoffs and help them get over the hump. But there is actually a plethora of cons, and one of which is something that I teased just a couple of minutes ago, and we'll get to that in segment 2 of Locked On Red Wings. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty, let's talk a little bit now about, we talked why he would fit in segment 1. Let's talk about why he wouldn't fit. And while you bring up a good point, and yes, you are correct, that he played in, Carolina Hurricanes are a monster. They are one of the most frustrating teams to play against in the NHL. Them and the New York Islanders are probably the games I put on, and I'm like, I want to fall asleep because they're so stingy defensively in the way that they block every shot attempt. They just are possession monsters. The Carolina Hurricanes led the league in shot attempts of 4 and were dead last in the league in shot attempts against, which again, when it comes to Corsi against, you at 5-on-5, you want to be at the bottom. It's like golf. The lower the score, the better. So their overall Corsi 4 percentage was number 1 in the league because they were the best in both of those categories. They're defensively, they don't give up shot attempts, and they possess the hell out of the puck. They are a puck possession team, and that starts in the defensive zone. They are a very defensively sound hockey team. And Martin Necas reportedly, I want to emphasize the reportedly part, is not a fan of playing a defensive style hockey game. And that is one of the big reasons why he reportedly wants to leave, or his dad at least. It's crazy that we're taking the words of a father, that not even the words of a father, but I think it was the head coach or the general manager talked about offhandedly, not fully naming Necas' father, but kind of alluding to as Necas' father wasn't happy that how Necas was being used. It's kind of crazy we're using that as what we've heard.
Yeah,
right? That's our source. But
yeah, there's a few of those these days. Yeah,
it's nuts. A weird world to be in, that a 25-year-old professional hockey player's dad is complaining about his son's ice time. But because of that, or I guess not because of that, but in part because of that, he wants to go to a system that's going to allow him to thrive a little bit more offensively and not emphasize as much the defensive side of the puck. Well, Scotty, that's not really what the Red Wings are trying to do. So while he fits that need as a top 6 scoring forward, if he's not going to try, or if he doesn't want to play defensive hockey, then it's not going to benefit what the Red Wings are trying to do. Derek Lalonde is a defensive-oriented head coach who's taking on the ideals and the structure of the Tampa Bay Lightning, where he came from. Steve Yzerman said in post-media availability that we need to get better defensively. That was his big talking point. And Martin Necas doesn't help you do that, because even on a very good Carolina Hurricanes team, he was -9 on the season, which, again, plus minus is one of the worst team stats you can use, because sometimes it's a product of everyone around you. It's a team stat. So when one player is -9, it doesn't take into account their usage. But if you want to take into account the usage, it does kind of emphasize that -9 a little bit more, because on the Dauber Hockey Frozen tools, and again, you're going to see this and you're going to be like, oh my God, look at all those players with offensive zone deployments. Well, that's because the entire team, the Carolina Hurricanes, were just possession monsters again. But Martin Necas, you can see on here, relative to his own teammates, because again, blue is positive relative, orange is negative relative. He was a negative relative to his teammates in Corsi 4 percentage, so shot attempt ratio, while despite getting the bulk majority offensive zone deployments, which again, everyone on that team does, minus Jordan Stahl and Jordan Martinook, but also getting competition that was softer than some of his teammates. Like look at Jake Guentzel, for example. Like Jake Guentzel is getting tougher competition than a lot of his teammates, is getting, granted, a lot more, even more offensive zone deployments than Martin Necas, but he's so heavily positive towards the puck possession of the team, where Martin Necas, despite getting those sheltered opportunities against weaker competition in the offensive zone, struggles to get more shot attempts for than face against. And that a lot of that comes with his what I would assume, again, I'm assuming because I don't watch the Carolina Hurricanes that closely. I'm making assumptions based on statistics. It seems like his unwillingness to want to play defense is leading to more opportunities against than for relative to his teammates. And that's my big worry with bringing someone like him in.
Yeah. I think the relative game is always interesting just because, I mean, if we're doing relative to other players on the Hurricanes, like that's, in general, that's going to be a higher bar than most. But I still think that it's a totally fair point. And I think I want to start with just like the Red Wings are not going to bring him in if they are not certain that he is comfortable playing in this system and they can extend him long term. They are not going to bring him in and then we're going to find out, halfway through a season one or, a week after we trade for him, we're going to find out, oh, like he hates the system. Like that's, you know what I mean? Like that's not going to happen. They're going to do their homework. They're going to make sure that they cover all their bases and that he's comfortable playing here and whatnot. I do think that it's a really fair point, though, and the Wings are just in such, I don't know, and a unique situation where like we're asking for a top six forward. We really want to bring in a top six forward, but we want a top six forward that, the front office has really been preaching defense. We want a top six forward that fits the system and can be defensive minded at a minimum, if not just play solid defense at best. But at the same time, to be a solidified top six player for a cup contending team, for a playoff team, et cetera, and kind of fit in with everybody else that's currently in the top six, we need, point production and
Right.
that ability as well. And it's like, well, that's a pretty darn good player, right? Like we need a guy who's a top six talent, who's really good defensively and produces points. That's a pretty darn good hockey player. That's going to be, those don't grow on trees. So it's just an interesting position where, you're trying to find the fit. And I agree with you. There are cons with Necas. And I think that the point you bring up there is probably one of the biggest ones, is that like we're having this conversation, we wouldn't have any issue bringing him in, barring a gross overpay by the Red Wings to bring him in. But if he doesn't want to play in a system like this, then this conversation's moot. And it's like, all right, well, that's it. That's the end of the conversation.
There it is. No,
right.
I mean, that's exactly it. You bring up a really good point. Like you're kind of in a rock and a hard place, because if you want a player that can do both offense and defense and play in the top six, I mean, you're talking about superstar level players, and those just aren't available. And the Red Wings are in a weird predicament where they need both players that will make this team better defensively, that fit the system, but like you said, that will provide offense. And so sometimes you just got to take the good with the bad. And I feel like in this instance, like he does solve that hole, right?
But is that worth
that hole? But like
the players and assets you have to give up and like $7 million AAV for long term? Do you want to make that type of commitment and then be like, well, we kind of have to, like, I don't know, like,
right.
You know what I mean? That doesn't really inject confidence into me either.
Well, you know what? That is a perfect segue into segment 3, where we'll talk about potentially what you may have to pay him first, / we'll speculate what you might have to trade for him as well in segment 3 of Locked On Red Wings. So stay tuned. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. All right, Scotty, you teased it there, right? Like, this is so weird, because if this was last year, right, and we're talking about a potential trade for a guy who can be a difference maker, like Alex DeBrincat, for example, who we had many conversations about. We were like, this team doesn't have this guy. We have the cap space. Bring him in and pay him. This is the first offseason where we're probably more on the side of maybe they shouldn't jump the gun for a guy because we are keeping in mind the cap situation. Because now with the looming contracts of Seider and Raymond, we have to worry about what it would take to keep a guy here and what that would mean for the cap situation going forward. And Martin Necas is really no exception to that conversation because Anthony DeMarco of the fourth period tweeted out last week that the general consensus with the league sources is that Martin Necas will be in line for a 6 to 8 year deal at a $7 to $7.5 million range. And that is cap-wise, cap hit-wise, is similar to what you're paying Alex DeBrincat right now, who has had 2 40-goal seasons already underneath his belt, is also not a defensive first guy, although I will say he improved vastly on that aspect of his game this past year. For a guy, and Martin Necas has not reached those heights that Alex DeBrincat has when you paid Alex DeBrincat for that over 4 years. So it's hard to convince me to commit 6 to 8 years to a guy who's hit like 70 points once, but then immediately came back down to the 50-point range and pay him $7.75 million in the process as well. And I know it sounds a little bit hypocritical because if this was the contract for Lucas Raymond, I'd be like, yeah, let's do it. And he only had 70 points once, right? But I think it's the difference there. And we're paying Lucas Raymond, who went from 50 points to 70
trajectory, recency
and
bias, et cetera.
And he's our guy, let's be honest. There's a little bit of a, our guy bias as well. But then you really want to lock up 8.5 to Larkin, $7+ million to DeBrincat, $7+ million to Necas, and then $7+ million to guys like Raymond and Seider. And I mean, this is where I just get so unsure with my own feelings on the matter, because on one hand, if you want to be a Stanley Cup contender, you got to pay guys, you got to play good players, good amount of money. But at the same time, I don't want to be teams that are so Toronto Maple Leafs, for example, and now they're paying some of their guys even more than the Red Wings I just listed, right? But they're a very top-heavy team and doesn't leave a lot of money to fill out your bottom lines to make that better. Their depth is not very good. So it's playing that balance where I'm thinking 7 to 7.5 for a guy who's had at 25 years old has had just one 70-point season. I get a little uneasy. And that doesn't even talk about what it would take to bring him here to the first place.
Right. And that's my point, is that's you're talking about a financial commitment and assets to acquire him and trade for him. Like you said, in the first place. I think the thing that I have confidence in with this front office and with Yzerman is that they are not going to build a super top heavy team. I think that's been whether it's been said straight up or whether it's been heavily alluded to and you can kind of just put the pieces together and insinuated based on what they've done. Depth clearly matters to this organization. And so I have confidence that they're not just going to become like the Leafs in terms of a lot of top-end talent, a lot of talent on the top 6, and then really nothing below that, nothing in the bottom 4 defensively, nothing in net, whatever. I think I think Yzerman has made it a point to be a lot deeper, and I think that a lot of that has to do with the farm system as well. Certainly helps goodness with that conversation as well. But I think honestly, that's probably why I lean towards this isn't gonna happen. All of this considered, right? I mean, again, if we found out tomorrow that he was on the team, great, and we'll break it down, and hopefully it's not, like I said earlier, hopefully it's not an overpay and we're getting rid of a ton of prospects that we really like and whatnot. Hopefully it's a solid deal that we can live with, and that'd be awesome. And it's, again, an immediate improvement to our top 6, which is something we want, and that's great. But there are a lot of wingers every year. That's that just comes with the territory. And I think you can probably find someone who is as you said, a better fit to what the Wings are trying to do here long term, probably, than this situation.
Yeah, I mean, like if you told me that they gave up the 15th overall pick, Jonathan Berggren, who, by the way, I love his personality, so I hope he can stay around because he's going to be super fun to be around in the locker room. But if you give up a guy who has been in trade talks for the Red Wings side of things, like Jonathan Berggren, who has a similar offensive upside, but again, why would they want him? He doesn't want to play defense. But hypothetically speaking, if you had told me they gave up Jonathan Berggren, 15th overall pick, and like a third or fourth round pick for this year or next year, I'd be like, okay, I can swallow that. And I saw the Hockey News speculate that he might get a DeBrincat style type bridge deal, right? 4 years at $7 million, I can swallow that. But once you get to 6 to 8 years at $7 million, now if he pans out, that's a great deal. In the last few years, especially as the cap goes up. But I don't have. And again, maybe it's because it's just not my guy, right? I don't have as much faith in him as I would in Lucas Raymond that's going to be sustainable on his end. Again, that could possibly just be personal and recency bias for what we watch all the time versus Necas, who we haven't seen a ton of. But the fact that I have to keep all of that in mind while, in context towards the cap, right? And with keeping in mind what the cap situation is going to be like, it makes me less willing to make a trade like that for a player like this than I would in years past, where I'd be like, yeah, let's go for it. We just need to get better. Like now we just have to be so careful with how we do it. And again, circling back to the beginning, might be the first time we've ever kind of been in a consensus where we're like, we're not sure we really do want him or it makes sense for the Red Wings to acquire him. Usually we're like, yes. But again, if the notification came that they traded for him, I'd be like, okay, cool. He solves a top 6 issue. He's going to get 50-plus points. That's a huge upside. He can play on the power play. But I would just heavily scrutinize the deal based on the return and what contract you're going to end up giving him. And that's where that's where I'm at right now.
For sure. I agree. I'll be honest with you. I think this has Boston Bruins written.
Oh, you shut your mouth.
All over it. I really do. That's a team that's deep, has the assets to acquire him, and has cap space, and he's young. They can, get a little bit younger with an offensive talent.
Boston has cap space?
Where have
I been?
Well, if you consider like the people that aren't re-signed right now, they have a little bit of space, but obviously they're going to bring back some of the, Swayman, whatever. They're going to bring back some of those guys.
Yeah, a lot of the guys that they're giving up. I mean, they should keep Jake DeBrusk if they're smart, but I don't know if they're going to be able to afford him. Yeah, yeah, they do have about $20 million as of right now. Obviously, Linus Ullmark is going to need, or Jeremy Swayman's going to need a new contract, and Ullmark's going to be UFA after next year, and Swayman's going to get paid. But then there's and guys, I know a couple comments on yesterday's episode about goaltenders. We were just focusing on free agent goaltenders. We will talk about.
Yeah, we have a whole roster of trade candidates.
Yeah. So don't worry, Ullmark is coming. But yes, that's where we're at with the Necas conversation. It's like, yeah, I would take him. I would just be really scrutinizing how we get him.
For sure. Yeah, no, this is a very stereotypical, like, comes down to the return or like comes down to the price. Not I think we're all pretty in lockstep about what kind of contract he would get, but at least AAV wise. Yeah. But I think that this acquisition would really, my thoughts would strictly come down to what we would have to give up to bring him in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounded like those were your final thoughts there.
But yeah. No, it addresses a need. Just again, have to make sure that the stars kind of align. And like I said earlier, the Wings are not about to bring in a guy that like doesn't like the system. They're going to do their homework and like make sure that he would want to play here and agrees with the style and whatnot. They wouldn't just like throw a dart at a board. So,
all right, Scotty, I'm going to ask your final thoughts strictly because you have a trademark response.
We ball.
We do ball. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. We're going to be we're going to do another draft profile with Scott Wheeler of The Athletic. So stay tuned for that. Same time, same place. It's your team every day.
Every day.